The landlord's voice on the phone was shaking when he said it. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think you should come to your son's apartment right now, but please don't tell your daughter or her husband." That moment happened only 2 hours after my son's memorial service ended. And what I saw when I opened Adrian's apartment door that night made me realize something terrifying. My son's death might not have been an accident at all. Before I tell you what happened inside that apartment, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the truth hides behind the people we trust the most. My name is Gloria Mitchell. I'm 65 years old, a retired forensic accountant, a widow of 6 years, and until recently I believed my son died in a tragic car accident. But the night I walked into Adrian's apartment after that phone call, my entire understanding of my family began to fall apart. Let me take you back to that day. It was a gray Thursday afternoon when we held my son Adrian Mitchell's memorial service. Adrian was 34 years old, my youngest child, a financial auditor who spent his life believing honesty mattered more than comfort. As his mother, I always admired that about him, but I never imagined that honesty might cost him his life. The church was full. Colleagues from Adrian's company, neighbors, family friends, and people I hadn't seen in years came to pay their respects. They all said the same thing: Adrian was a good man. He worked too hard. It's such a tragedy. The official story was simple: a car accident on a rainy highway. His car had supposedly skidded off the road late at night. The police closed the investigation within days. Tragic but straightforward. And for a while, I forced myself to accept that explanation. But something about Adrian's death never sat comfortably in my heart. I've spent 30 years studying financial patterns, investigating irregularities in corporate accounts, and one lesson stayed with me throughout my career: accidents rarely happen without leaving clues. That afternoon, after the memorial ended, my daughter Natalie Carter, my 37-year-old daughter and Adrian's older sister, was sitting beside me in the church pew. Natalie is a school counselor, a gentle soul who feels everything deeply. She had been crying almost nonstop since the service began. Her husband Brandon Carter, my son-in-law, stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders. Brandon is 40, charming, confident, and very persuasive. He works in corporate operations at the same logistics company where Adrian worked as an auditor. That connection had always made me feel comforted before. After all, who better to look out for my son at work than family? But that day, I remember watching Brandon's face while people spoke about Adrian. Everyone else looked heartbroken. Brandon looked controlled, calm, too calm. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. Grief does strange things to the mind. After the service, people slowly left the church parking lot. Natalie hugged me tightly. "Mom, please come stay with us tonight," she said. "You shouldn't be alone." I smiled and touched her cheek. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. I just need some quiet time." Brandon nodded politely. "Call us if you need anything, Gloria." I watched them drive away together. For a long moment, I stood there alone in the parking lot. I remember thinking that the silence felt heavier than the funeral itself. When I finally arrived home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room surrounded by photographs of Adrian. There was one of him at 12 years old holding a science fair trophy, another from his college graduation, and one taken just 2 months before his death, smiling awkwardly at the camera like he always did. That's when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I wouldn't answer unknown numbers that late in the evening, but something made me pick up. "Mrs. Mitchell?" a man asked quietly. "Yes, my name is Samuel Green. I manage the apartment building where Adrian lived." Samuel Green, the apartment manager. I had met him once when helping Adrian move in 2 years earlier. He was a quiet man in his late 50s who paid attention to details. "Is something wrong?" I asked. He hesitated before speaking again. "I know today was your son's memorial and I'm very sorry for your loss." I felt my chest tighten. "Thank you." Then his voice dropped lower. "But there's something in Adrian's apartment you need to see." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Another pause. "It's difficult to explain over the phone." My instincts immediately woke up. After decades in financial investigations, I had learned to recognize when someone was afraid to say something directly. "Mr. Green, if something was found in my son's apartment, the police should have seen it already." "That's the thing," he replied quietly. They didn't. I sat upright. What exactly are you saying? His next sentence is the one that appeared later on the thumbnail of this story, the sentence that changed everything. Mrs. Mitchell, you need to come here tonight. But please don't tell your daughter Natalie or her husband Brandon. My heart skipped. Why would you say that? Because, he said slowly, I'm not sure who else knows about what I found. The room suddenly felt colder. What did you find? I asked. Samuel Green lowered his voice even more. Something your son hid. I didn't say anything for several seconds. My mind started racing through possibilities, documents, a note. Something related to the accident? Then Samuel added one more sentence that sent a chill down my spine. And after I saw it, I don't think your son believed he was safe. I was already reaching for my car keys. I'm on my way, I told him. 20 minutes later, I was driving through the quiet streets toward Adrian's apartment building. The entire time, one question repeated in my mind. Why would the apartment manager tell me not to inform my own daughter and son-in-law? When I arrived, Samuel Green was standing outside the building entrance waiting for me. His expression looked tense. Thank you for coming, he said as he unlocked the door. You said you found something, I replied. Yes. He led me upstairs toward Adrian's apartment. Every step down that hallway felt heavier than the last. When we reached the door, Samuel hesitated before unlocking it. Mrs. Mitchell, before you see this, I need you to understand something. What? He looked directly at me. Your son was asking questions during the weeks before he died. My stomach tightened. Questions about what? Samuel opened the door slowly. About money. The apartment was exactly the way Adrian had left it. His laptop sat on the desk. Papers were neatly stacked in folders. Nothing looked unusual. But Samuel walked straight to a bookshelf beside the desk and reached behind a row of books. He pulled out a small black device. I found this while preparing the apartment for new tenants, he said quietly. It was hidden behind these books. I took the device from his hand. It was smaller than my phone. What is it? Samuel answered slowly. A voice recorder. My heart started pounding. I charged it earlier today to see if it worked. He swallowed hard. It does. I looked down at the device in my hand, then Samuel said something that made the air leave my lungs. Mrs. Mitchell, the recording on that device starts with your son arguing with someone. I felt a sudden chill run through my body. Arguing with who? Samuel shook his head. I didn't recognize the voice. I stared at the recorder for several seconds before asking the one question I was suddenly afraid to hear answered. What were they arguing about? Samuel looked directly into my eyes and said quietly, money that was stolen from Adrian's company. My fingers tightened around the recorder. And then he added the sentence that made my entire world begin to shift. And whoever that voice belongs to sounded like someone Adrian knew very well. I didn't press play on the recording yet, because deep down I already had a terrifying feeling about whose voice I might hear. In the moment I finally listened to it, I realized my son's accident might have been the beginning of something far darker than any of us imagined. When I finally pressed the play button on that small recorder in my son Adrian's apartment, the first thing I heard was silence, followed by the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. That silence lasted only 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds felt heavier than the entire memorial service we had just attended. Because in those seconds I realized something important. My son hadn't hidden that recorder by accident. He had hidden it because he expected something to happen. Before I tell you what the recording revealed, remember something I learned during my 30 years as a forensic accountant. When honest people start documenting conversations secretly, it usually means they believe the truth is in danger. I was standing inside Adrian's apartment with Samuel Green, the building manager who had called me earlier that evening. Samuel stood quietly near the door, his hands folded, watching my face carefully. You may want to sit down before listening, he said gently. I nodded but didn't sit. Instead, I stood beside Adrian's desk, holding the recorder in my hand. The small device felt heavier than it should have. You already listened to it? I asked Samuel. He hesitated before answering. Only the first few seconds. Enough to know it wasn't something the police had seen. That sentence alone told me this was serious. I pressed play. At first there was only background noise, then I heard Adrian's voice. Calm, controlled, focused. You shouldn't have come here tonight. My chest tightened immediately. I would recognize my son's voice anywhere. Adrian Mitchell, my 34-year-old son, had always spoken in a careful tone, like a man who measured his words before releasing them into the world. Then another voice answered, a male voice. You're the one who asked to talk? My fingers tightened around the recorder. The voice was slightly distorted, but one thing was clear. Adrian knew the man speaking. I asked you to explain something, Adrian replied. Papers rustled in the recording. $218,000 doesn't just disappear from a company account. The air left my lungs. Samuel Green looked at me. He clearly hadn't heard that part yet. I pressed pause. For a moment, neither of us spoke. As a forensic accountant, numbers were the language of my life, and the moment Adrian said that number, I understood something. $200,000 wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern, a crime. I pressed play again. Adrian continued speaking in the recording. I checked the logistics expense accounts 3 times, he said. The transfers were hidden under shipping vendor adjustments. The second voice answered again, quieter this time. You're digging into things that don't concern you. That sentence sent a chill through my spine. Adrian replied calmly. I'm the financial auditor. Everything concerning company money concerns me. Then came a long pause in the recording. A pause so tense that even standing in that empty apartment 2 weeks after Adrian's death, I could feel the pressure of that moment. Finally, the second man spoke again. If you take this further, it will ruin a lot of lives. Adrian answered with something that made my throat tighten. The only person ruining lives is the one stealing the money. Silence followed again. I paused the recording once more. My mind was already moving faster than my emotions. That's something that happens after decades in investigative work. Even when your heart is breaking, your brain still wants answers. I turned to Samuel Green. When exactly did you find this? Samuel explained that he discovered the recorder earlier that afternoon while preparing Adrian's apartment for cleaning after the memorial. It was hidden behind books, he said. Adrian must have placed it there intentionally. I nodded slowly. That made sense. Adrian had always been careful. If he suspected financial fraud at work, he would absolutely document conversations. But one question now mattered more than anything else. Who was the other voice? I pressed play again. Adrian spoke first. I already documented the transactions, he said. Every transfer, every shell account. My heart started pounding harder. Shell accounts? That meant someone had built an entire structure to hide stolen money. The second man suddenly sounded angry. You think you're smarter than everyone else? Adrian didn't raise his voice. That was his way. No, I just know when numbers don't make sense. Then the recording captured something that made both Samuel and me freeze. A glass hit the table. Hard, the second man spoke again, his voice lower now. You need to drop this investigation. Adrian replied with one sentence that made my eyes fill with tears. I'm not afraid of the truth. There was a sharp laugh from the other man. Maybe you should be? My hand trembled slightly as I continued listening. Then Adrian said something that changed everything. Brandon, you need to stop this before it destroys the family. The recorder slipped in my hand. For a moment I thought I had misheard the name, but the device kept playing. The other voice responded instantly. Don't say my name. My heart began beating so loudly I could barely hear the recording anymore. Brandon. My son-in-law Brandon Carter, my daughter Natalie's husband. The man who had stood beside her crying at Adrian's memorial just hours earlier. I pressed pause again. The apartment suddenly felt smaller. Samuel Green looked confused. Who's Brandon? He asked quietly. My throat felt dry when I answered. My son-in-law. Samuel's face went pale. I stared at the recorder in my hand. My son Adrian had been confronting Brandon about stolen company money. That meant Brandon had access to the accounts Adrian audited, and it also meant something else. Adrian had discovered the fraud before he died. Samuel spoke carefully. Mrs. Mitchell, do you think the accident? He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because the same thought had already formed inside my mind. I pressed play again, forcing myself to hear the rest. Adrian's voice returned. You can still fix this, he said in the recording. Brandon's voice sounded tense now. You don't understand the situation? Then explain it, Adrian replied. Another long pause followed, then Brandon spoke quietly. Some people don't let debts go unpaid. My chest tightened again. Debts, that meant the fraud might not have started as greed, it might have started as desperation. Adrian replied calmly, "If you're in trouble, we can solve it together." That sentence broke my heart. Even after discovering the fraud, Adrian was still trying to help. That was exactly the kind of man my son was. Honest, loyal, too loyal sometimes. Brandon answered in a colder tone. "You should have stayed out of this." The recording ended there. I stared at the device for a long moment. The apartment was completely silent again. Finally, Samuel Green spoke softly. "Your son knew he was dealing with something serious." I nodded slowly. Yes, Adrian had known. That was why he hid the recorder. That was why he documented the conversation. Because he understood something dangerous was happening. I placed the recorder carefully on the desk. My hands were steady now, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I had spent my entire career investigating financial crimes, and suddenly the pieces were starting to move into place. Adrian had discovered stolen company funds. The fraud involved shell accounts, and the person connected to it was Brandon Carter, my daughter Natalie's husband. I turned to Samuel. "I need copies of this recording." He nodded immediately. "Of course." But as I looked around Adrian's apartment, something else began to bother me. If Adrian suspected Brandon, why didn't he report it before he died? That question stayed in my mind as I picked up the recorder again. Because something told me this recording was only the beginning. And somewhere inside Adrian's files, there had to be proof of what he discovered. What I didn't realize yet was that someone else already knew Adrian had been investigating. And very soon, that person would realize I was listening too. The moment I heard my son Adrian say my son-in-law Brandon's name on that recording, something inside me shifted. Not emotionally, but professionally. For 30 years I worked as a forensic accountant, and one rule guided every investigation I ever handled. When money disappears, someone always leaves a trail behind. And Adrian had clearly started following that trail before he died. I was still standing inside Adrian's apartment with Samuel Green, the quiet apartment manager who had called me after the memorial. The small recorder sat on the desk between us, silent now, but its impact echoed loudly in my mind. Brandon Carter, my daughter Natalie's husband, the man who had stood beside her during the funeral, comforting her while we mourned Adrian. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Emotional reactions could come later. Right now I needed clarity. "Mr. Green," I said quietly, "did anyone else know you found this recorder?" Samuel shook his head immediately. "No, ma'am. I called you the moment I realized what it was." That answer gave me a small sense of relief. Because if Brandon truly was involved in something dangerous, the last thing I wanted was for him to know the recording existed. I picked up the device again and placed it carefully into my purse. "For now," I said, "this stays between us." Samuel nodded. "I understand." But as I turned toward Adrian's desk, something else began to bother me. Adrian had been a meticulous man. Everything in his apartment reflected that: organized folders, labeled documents, neatly stacked notebooks. A man like Adrian wouldn't record only one conversation if he believed something serious was happening. There had to be more. I sat down at his desk and opened the laptop that still rested there. The screen lit up instantly. Adrian had never been careless with technology, which meant if he had gathered evidence about financial fraud, he likely stored it somewhere secure. But when the desktop appeared, it looked almost empty, too empty. Only a few ordinary work folders were visible. "That's strange," I murmured. Samuel looked over my shoulder. "What is?" "Adrian never worked with such small data sets," I explained. "Financial investigations produce files, reports, spreadsheets, records. Yet none of those things were visible." I opened the file directory again, double-checking every folder. Still nothing unusual. That was when another possibility crossed my mind. Someone might have deleted them. My stomach tightened slightly. If Brandon knew Adrian had been investigating him, it would make sense for someone to remove evidence from Adrian's computer. I closed the laptop slowly. "Mr. Green, has anyone entered this apartment since Adrian died?" Samuel thought carefully. "Only the police for the accident report and then the cleaning crew once." "No one from his company?" "No," I nodded slowly. That meant if files had been deleted, it likely happened before Adrian died. Which meant Adrian may have hidden his evidence somewhere else. I stood up and began looking around the apartment more carefully. That's when I noticed something small on the bookshelf beside the desk, the same place where Samuel had discovered the recorder. A photograph frame. It held a picture of Adrian standing beside two coworkers at a company event. One of them was a woman I didn't recognize. Samuel noticed me studying the picture. That woman visited Adrian a few times, he said casually. I looked up. You remember her? Yes, she worked with him. Quiet woman, Asian, always carried a laptop bag. My mind immediately sharpened. Did you ever hear her name? Samuel thought for a moment. Lena, I think. Lena. I suddenly remembered Adrian mentioning someone with that name months earlier. Lena Park. She worked as a risk analyst at the same logistics company. Adrian once told me she was one of the few employees who actually cared about financial transparency. Which meant if Adrian had been investigating fraud, Lena might have known about it. I took a picture of the photograph with my phone before setting the frame back down. Mr. Green, I asked carefully, did Adrian ever seem worried before his accident? Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to the kitchen counter and leaned against it. About 2 weeks before he died, he finally said, he asked me something strange. My attention sharpened instantly. What did he ask? Samuel looked uncomfortable. He asked if the security cameras in the building ever stopped recording. My heart skipped. What did you tell him? I told him they run 24 hours a day. A cold realization began forming in my mind. If Adrian asked about cameras, that meant he believed someone might be watching him. Did he say why he asked? Samuel shook his head slowly. But he looked tense. I stared down at Adrian's desk again. My son had hidden a recorder. He had asked about surveillance cameras, and now his files were missing. Those were not the actions of a man who believed everything was normal. Those were the actions of a man who believed something dangerous was happening around him. My phone suddenly buzzed in my purse. The sound made both Samuel and me jump slightly. I pulled the phone out. It was my daughter Natalie calling. Natalie Carter, my 37-year-old daughter and Adrian's older sister. She had always been the emotional center of our family, gentle, trusting, and deeply loyal. But she also trusted her husband Brandon completely. I hesitated before answering. Hi, Mom, Natalie said softly when I picked up. Her voice still sounded tired from crying earlier that day. Are you okay? I'm fine, I replied calmly, just resting. Brandon and I were worried about you being alone tonight. My eyes moved slowly toward the recorder inside my purse. Brandon, the man whose voice I had just heard threatening my son. That's very thoughtful, I said carefully. Natalie continued speaking. Brandon says if you need help organizing Adrian's things, we can come by tomorrow. I felt a small chill run through my spine. Brandon wanted access to Adrian's apartment. My voice remained steady. That won't be necessary. Are you sure? She asked. Yes, I replied gently. I'll handle it. We spoke for another minute before ending the call. As soon as the line disconnected, I looked at Samuel. I need to move carefully now, I said. If Brandon suspects I found something, he'll try to erase the rest of the evidence. Samuel nodded slowly. What will you do? I thought for a moment before answering. I need someone who specializes in digital recovery. Someone who could access deleted files, restore hidden data, and see exactly what Adrian had been working on before he died. There was only one person I trusted for that kind of work. Ethan Cole, a former digital forensics investigator who had helped me years ago during a corporate fraud case. Ethan was methodical, discreet, and extremely good at finding information that others thought was gone forever. I took out my phone and typed a short message. Ethan, this is Gloria Mitchell. I believe my son discovered financial fraud before he died. I need your help recovering files from his laptop. I hesitated before pressing send, because once this investigation started, there would be no turning back. I sent the message, then I closed Adrian's laptop and placed it into my bag beside the recorder. I'm taking this with me, I told Samuel. Of course. As I walked toward the apartment door, one final thought crossed my mind. Adrian had confronted Brandon about stolen company money, and now the evidence of that investigation had been erased from his computer. But digital trails are stubborn things. They don't disappear easily. And once Ethan Cole started looking through Adrian's laptop, we were going to learn exactly what my son discovered. What I didn't realize yet was that Adrian hadn't been working alone. Because somewhere inside those missing files, there was proof that another person inside that company had been helping him quietly. And that person was about to change everything. The moment I sent that message to Ethan Cole, I knew the direction my life was about to take. For 2 weeks, I had believed my son Adrian died in a simple accident. But now I was standing in his apartment holding a hidden recorder that captured him confronting my own son-in-law Brandon about stolen money. When a mother begins uncovering secrets about her own family, the ground beneath her feet starts to feel unstable. But there was something else I learned during my years as a forensic accountant. Truth rarely appears all at once. It reveals itself piece by piece, often through the smallest overlooked details. And that night, I was about to discover the first of those details. I left Adrian's apartment carrying his laptop in my bag, the recorder safely tucked inside a pocket. Samuel Green, the building manager who had helped me discover the device, walked with me down the hallway toward the elevator. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "if there's anything else I can do—" I paused and looked at him. "You've already done more than you realize." Because without Samuel's call, that recorder might have been thrown away during cleaning, and Adrian's voice would have disappeared forever. Outside, the night air felt unusually cold. I drove home slowly, replaying the recording in my mind again and again. Adrian confronting Brandon. Adrian trying to reason with him. Adrian still believing that the situation could be fixed. That was exactly the kind of man my son was, honest to the point of risking his own safety. When I arrived home, I placed Adrian's laptop carefully on my dining table. The house was quiet, filled with the same silence I had lived with since my husband passed away 6 years earlier. Widowhood teaches you patience. It teaches you how to sit with uncomfortable truths. And tonight, patience was exactly what I needed. 30 minutes later, my phone vibrated. Ethan Cole had replied. His message was short. "I'm available tonight, send location." That was Ethan's style, direct and efficient. Ethan Cole was 45 years old, a former digital forensics investigator who had spent years recovering data for corporate investigations and legal cases. I had worked with him on several difficult fraud cases before retiring, and there was one reason I trusted him completely. Ethan cared more about evidence than about opinions. I texted him my address. He arrived 40 minutes later. When I opened the door, he was standing there with a laptop bag over his shoulder and a small metal equipment case in his hand. "Gloria," he said, giving me a brief nod. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "So do I." I led him inside and placed Adrian's laptop on the table. Ethan sat down immediately, opening his equipment case. Inside were cables, external drives, and small diagnostic tools. "Tell me what you know so far," he said. As he connected the laptop to his system, I told him everything. The recorder. The argument between Adrian and Brandon. The missing files. Ethan listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back slightly in his chair. "If someone deleted files recently," he said calmly, "there's a good chance I can recover them." My heart tightened slightly. "How long will it take?" "Depends how careful the person was." He started typing commands on his screen. Lines of code appeared rapidly. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan suddenly said something interesting. "Your son was cautious." I stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Ethan pointed to the screen. "Someone wiped several folders, but Adrian created hidden backup partitions." My chest filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Of course he had. Adrian had learned financial investigation from watching me work for years. "Can you open them?" Ethan gave a small smile. "Already working on it." The computer processed data for nearly a minute. Then new folders appeared on Ethan's screen. Hundreds of files, spreadsheets, transaction logs, bank transfer records. My breath caught. Adrian had been documenting everything. Ethan opened one spreadsheet and studied it closely. His expression slowly changed. "This isn't small-scale fraud," he said. I felt my stomach tighten. "How much?" Ethan zoomed into the financial totals column. "Over $800,000. The room went completely silent. $800,000. That wasn't desperation. That was an operation. Ethan continued scanning through the files. Multiple shell accounts, layered transfers. Adrian was tracking every movement. I stared at the screen, trying to process the numbers. My son had uncovered a massive financial scheme inside his company, and Brandon had clearly been involved. But then Ethan stopped scrolling and leaned closer to the monitor. Interesting. What is it? I asked. He clicked another folder. Inside were several messages saved from Adrian's encrypted email system. Ethan opened one. The sender's name appeared immediately, Lena Park. My mind flashed back to the photograph I saw earlier in Adrian's apartment. The woman standing beside him at the company event. Lena Park was a 32-year-old risk analyst who worked at the same logistics company. Ethan read the email silently before speaking. Your son wasn't investigating alone. I stepped closer. What do you mean? Ethan turned the screen slightly so I could read the message. Lena's email said, Adrian, I confirmed the shipping contract numbers. Brandon authorized the transfers personally. We need more proof before reporting this. My chest tightened again. Lena had been helping Adrian gather evidence. That meant someone inside the company already suspected Brandon's fraud. Ethan opened another message. This one was sent just 3 days before Adrian died. The subject line made my heart pound. Meeting tonight. The message read, Adrian, be careful. Brandon asked questions about the audit files today. I think he knows you're investigating. We should talk somewhere private. I sat down slowly in the chair beside Ethan. Adrian knew Brandon suspected him, yet he still met with him. That meant the confrontation on the recorder might have been planned. Ethan opened one final file. It was an audio recording label, backup conversation. But when he tried to open it, an error message appeared. File corrupted, Ethan muttered. Can you recover it? I asked quietly. He leaned forward again. Maybe. As Ethan began running recovery software, a new thought began forming in my mind. Adrian had hidden the recorder. He had documented financial transfers. He had worked with Lena to gather proof. That meant Adrian was preparing to expose Brandon. And if Brandon knew that, I suddenly felt a cold weight settle in my chest. Because Adrian died the same week he confronted him. Ethan finally leaned back after a few minutes. The corrupted file will take time to rebuild, he said, but there's something else you should see first. He opened another document Adrian had saved. It was a timeline, dates, meetings, transaction records. Adrian had written notes beside each entry. At the bottom of the page was one final sentence. I read it slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. If anything happens to me, Lena has the rest of the files. The room fell silent again. Adrian had anticipated danger. He had prepared backups. And he had trusted someone named Lena Park to hold the final pieces of evidence. Ethan looked at me. Sounds like you need to find her. I nodded slowly. Yes, because Lena Park might know exactly what Adrian discovered during the final days before his death. And if she had the rest of Adrian's evidence, she might also know the one thing I feared the most. What really happened the night my son died. The sentence Adrian wrote at the bottom of that file kept echoing in my mind long after Ethan Cole closed the laptop. If anything happens to me, Lena has the rest of the files. When a careful man like my son writes something like that, it isn't paranoia. It's preparation, and preparation usually means he believed the danger was real. I sat at the dining table staring at the screen while Ethan packed away some of his equipment. My home was quiet again, but now the silence carried a new weight. Because the more I learned about Adrian's investigation, the clearer one fact became. My son had been expecting something to go wrong. We need to find Lena Park, Ethan said calmly. I nodded slowly. Lena Park, the 32-year-old risk analyst who worked with Adrian at the logistics company. The woman who had helped him track the fraudulent transactions connected to my son-in-law Brandon Carter. The woman who might be holding the final evidence Adrian gathered before he died. But before I could respond, my phone vibrated again on the table. This time the name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Natalie, my daughter Natalie Carter, Adrian's older sister. I answered the call carefully. Hi, sweetheart. Natalie's voice sounded tired but calmer than earlier. Mom, Brandon and I were thinking about you. Are you sure you're okay tonight? My eyes moved slowly toward Adrian's laptop. I'm fine, I said gently. Natalie hesitated before continuing. Brandon said he might stop by tomorrow and help sort through Adrian's files at the apartment. My chest tightened again. Brandon wanted access to Adrian's things. That meant either he suspected Adrian had documented something, or he simply wanted to be certain nothing remained. I kept my voice steady. That won't be necessary. Natalie sounded surprised. But Mom, I'll take care of it, I said softly. You should focus on resting. After a few more minutes of conversation, we ended the call. The moment I set the phone down, Ethan spoke quietly. He's nervous. I looked at him. You heard that too? Ethan nodded. People involved in fraud become very interested in evidence after someone dies. That was exactly what worried me. If Brandon was already thinking about Adrian's files, it meant time was running out. Ethan reopened the laptop briefly and copied several recovered folders onto an external drive. You should keep backups, he said. Multiple copies. I watched him work. Adrian had already done the same thing with Lena. My son had anticipated the risk long before I even realized there was one. When Ethan finished, he handed me the small drive. Tomorrow we should contact Lena Park, he said. If she has the rest of Adrian's evidence, she may also know what happened before the accident. I nodded slowly, but something inside me was still unsettled. Adrian had written that message as a precaution, which meant he had believed the confrontation with Brandon could become dangerous. I stood and walked toward the living room window, staring out into the quiet street. Streetlights glowed faintly in the darkness. And for the first time since Adrian died, a terrible possibility entered my mind clearly. What if the accident wasn't an accident at all? Ethan must have sensed my thoughts. Gloria, he said carefully, financial crimes often escalate when someone threatens to expose them. I didn't answer immediately, because if Brandon truly believed Adrian was about to reveal everything, desperation might have pushed him to do something unthinkable. The next morning arrived slowly. I barely slept that night. My mind kept replaying Adrian's voice on the recorder, the confrontation with Brandon, the evidence hidden in his computer. But by morning, my emotions had settled into something steadier: determination. At 65 years old, after decades of investigating financial deception, I had learned something important. Panic destroys clarity, but patience reveals truth. Ethan returned to my house around 10 that morning. Together we reviewed Adrian's recovered files again: transaction histories, shell accounts, corporate expense manipulation. Every record pointed in the same direction. Brandon Carter had been moving company funds through layered accounts for nearly 2 years, but one question remained unanswered. Why? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Fraud like this usually means someone is under financial pressure. I nodded slowly. Brandon had always appeared confident and successful, but appearances can hide many things. Finally, Ethan turned the laptop toward me again. We should call Lena now. I hesitated for a moment before dialing the number Adrian had saved in his contacts. The phone rang twice before a woman answered. Hello, her voice sounded cautious. Is this Lena Park? I asked. Yes, who is this? My name is Gloria Mitchell. I paused before continuing. Adrian Mitchell was my son. Silence filled the line instantly. Then Lena spoke again, her voice suddenly tense. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm so sorry for your loss. I swallowed gently. Thank you, but Lena, I believe Adrian left evidence with you. Another long silence followed. I could almost hear her thinking through the situation. Finally, she asked quietly, Did you find the recorder? My heart skipped. She already knew about it. Yes, I replied. Lena exhaled slowly on the phone. Then Adrian was right. Right about what? I asked. Her next words made the room feel suddenly smaller. He said if something happened to him, the truth would eventually reach you. I gripped the phone tighter. Lena, I need to know what Adrian discovered. There was another pause before she answered. It's worse than you think. Ethan looked at me sharply from across the table. Lena continued speaking. Adrian didn't just uncover stolen money, he uncovered where it was going. My chest tightened. What do you mean? Lena's voice dropped even lower. The money Brandon was moving wasn't just disappearing. My heart began beating faster. Then where was it going? Lena answered with a sentence that changed everything about the investigation. To someone who was threatening him? I felt the blood drain from my face. Brandon Carter hadn't just been stealing money, he had been paying someone. And suddenly the entire situation looked far more dangerous than simple corporate fraud. Because if Brandon was being threatened, it meant Adrian might have stepped into something much larger than we ever imagined. And the person behind those threats might still be watching. The moment Lena Park told me that the stolen money wasn't just disappearing, but was being paid to someone who was threatening Brandon Carter. Everything about my son Adrian's death suddenly looked different. Until that moment, I believed I was uncovering corporate fraud. But now it felt like Adrian had stepped into something far more dangerous. I sat at my dining table holding the phone while Ethan Cole watched me carefully from across the room. "Lena," I said slowly, "start from the beginning. Adrian trusted you. That means I can trust you too." There was a quiet pause on the line before Lena answered. "Your son started investigating the shipping department accounts 3 months ago. At first it looked like small accounting errors, but Adrian noticed a pattern." My chest tightened slightly. Patterns. That was exactly how Adrian had learned to investigate, by watching me work for years. Lena continued, "Every time money was moved into the vendor accounts, a portion was quietly redirected through a secondary approval system. That approval came from Brandon." Ethan leaned forward slightly, listening closely. "Adrian suspected embezzlement?" I asked. "At first, yes," Lena replied. "But when we followed the transfers, we discovered something strange." I could hear the hesitation in her voice. The money wasn't going into personal accounts. My stomach tightened again. "Then where?" Lena lowered her voice. "Into accounts controlled by someone outside the company." I exchanged a glance with Ethan. That confirmed what she had said earlier. Brandon hadn't been stealing money for himself, he had been sending it somewhere else. "Did Adrian find out who controlled those accounts?" I asked. Lena exhaled slowly. "Partially. The accounts were layered through several shell companies, but one name appeared repeatedly." My grip on the phone tightened. "What name?" Lena answered quietly. "A consulting firm called Westbridge Holdings." Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly. He immediately opened his laptop and began typing the name. I waited silently while Lena continued speaking. "Adrian believed Westbridge wasn't a real consulting company. It was a front." Ethan suddenly turned the laptop toward me. "She's right," he said quietly. On the screen was a corporate registration page. Westbridge Holdings existed, but it had no employees, no physical office, and almost no public records. "A shell company," Lena spoke again. "Adrian believed Brandon was being pressured to move company funds through Westbridge." My mind began connecting the pieces. Brandon wasn't just committing fraud, someone was forcing him to do it. "Did Adrian confront him about that?" I asked. "Yes," Lena said softly. "That's the conversation you heard on the recorder." My heart tightened remembering Adrian's calm voice in that recording. Adrian had tried to help Brandon. He had tried to fix the situation, but Lena's next sentence made my blood run cold. "After that meeting," she said, "Adrian told me something that scared him." "What?" I asked. "He said Brandon wasn't the one truly in control." The room fell silent. Ethan stopped typing and looked up. "What do you mean?" I asked slowly. Lena hesitated before answering. "Adrian believed someone else inside the company knew about the fraud and might be coordinating it." That possibility sent a chill through my spine. Because if someone else inside the company was involved, it meant the situation was bigger than Brandon alone. Lena continued, "3 days before Adrian died, he told me he planned to present the evidence to the company board." My chest tightened. "And Brandon knew?" "Yes," Lena replied. "That's why Adrian recorded their meeting. He wanted proof that Brandon was involved." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "So Brandon had motive to stop him?" Lena didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said something that changed the direction of the entire investigation. "The night before Adrian died, he sent me one final message." My breath caught slightly. "What did it say?" Lena read it slowly from memory. "If something happens to me tomorrow, give everything to my mother. She'll know what to do." Tears stung my eyes for the first time since the investigation began. Even in danger, Adrian had trusted me to finish what he started. Lena continued, "I still have the rest of Adrian's files. Transaction reports, internal emails, and the identity of the person behind Westbridge Holdings." Ethan looked at me immediately. That was the piece we needed most. "Lena," I said carefully, "where are you right now?" She hesitated. "At home. We need to meet," I said. "Tonight?" Another pause followed. Then Lena replied quietly, "Adrian told me you would say that." I almost smiled despite the tension. That sounded exactly like my son. "There's just one problem," Lena added. My heart tightened again. "What problem?" Lena's voice dropped to a whisper. Brandon came to the office this morning. Ethan and I both froze. Why? I asked. He was asking questions about Adrian's files. My stomach turned cold. Brandon was already searching for the evidence Adrian had left behind. Lena continued carefully. I think he suspects someone still has the data. Ethan leaned forward. Then we need to move fast. I nodded slowly, already thinking ahead, because if Brandon believed evidence still existed, he might do anything to find it. Lena, I said firmly, listen carefully. Do not bring those files to the office. Do not tell anyone where they are. I won't, she replied. Where should we meet? I thought for a moment before answering. A public place. Somewhere safe? Ethan suggested a quiet cafe across town that stayed open late and had security cameras. Lena agreed to meet us there in 2 hours. When the call ended, the house fell silent again. Ethan closed his laptop slowly. We're getting close to the truth now, he said. I nodded. Yes, we were. Adrian had uncovered financial fraud. Brandon had been moving money under pressure. And someone behind a shell company called Westbridge Holdings was pulling the strings. But something about the situation still troubled me. Because if Brandon was only a middleman, the real person behind this scheme was still out there. And that person had already proven they were willing to let my son die to keep their secret safe. As I picked up my coat to leave, one final thought crossed my mind. Tonight we were going to meet Lena Park. And she was bringing the last evidence Adrian left behind. Evidence that could expose the entire operation. What I didn't realize yet was that someone else might also be watching that meeting very carefully. The night we arranged to meet Lena Park felt heavier than any night I could remember since Adrian died. When a person spends decades studying deception, you eventually develop an instinct for the moment when a situation becomes truly dangerous. And as Ethan Cole and I drove toward the small cafe where Lena had agreed to meet us, that instinct was telling me something important. Someone else might already know what we were doing. I sat in the passenger seat watching the streetlights pass through the windshield. Ethan drove calmly, but I could tell his mind was working through possibilities just like mine. If Brandon suspects Lena has the evidence, he said quietly, he may try to reach her before we do. I nodded slowly. Which is why we need to move carefully tonight. The cafe Ethan had chosen sat on the corner of a busy downtown street. Bright lights, large windows, security cameras on every corner of the building, a place where nothing could happen quietly. That was exactly what we needed. When we arrived, Lena Park was already sitting at a small table near the window. She looked younger than I remembered from Adrian's photograph. 32 years old with tired eyes and a laptop bag resting beside her chair. The moment she saw me walk in, she stood up quickly. Mrs. Mitchell, she said softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke, because we both understood the strange connection between us. She had worked with my son during the final weeks of his life, and now she was carrying the evidence he left behind. Thank you for coming, I said gently. Lena nodded. Adrian trusted you, that's why I agreed to meet. Ethan joined us at the table and introduced himself. Lena opened her laptop bag carefully and removed a small external hard drive. My heartbeat quickened slightly when I saw it. Everything Adrian gave me is on this, she said quietly. Ethan immediately connected the drive to his laptop. Files began appearing on the screen, spreadsheets, transaction records, internal company emails. The evidence Adrian had gathered was even more detailed than we expected. But one folder caught my attention immediately. It was labeled WESTBRIDGE Primary Contact. Ethan opened it. Inside were several scanned documents and financial transfer confirmations. At the center of every record was the same name. My breath stopped when I read it. Not Brandon Carter, someone else. Ethan stared at the screen in disbelief. This doesn't make sense, he muttered. Lena looked confused. What is it? I leaned forward slowly, reading the name again, because the person behind Westbridge Holdings wasn't Brandon. It was someone far more powerful inside the company. Someone Adrian never expected to be involved. Lena whispered. Adrian didn't believe it at first either. Ethan scrolled further through the files. One document showed a series of authorization approvals connected to the shell accounts. Each approval came from the same executive department. Brandon wasn't running the operation, Ethan said quietly. He was being used. My mind began connecting the final pieces. Brandon had been moving the money, yes. But someone above him inside the company had designed the system, and that person had far more to lose if Adrian exposed the fraud. Lena opened another file. Adrian recorded one more meeting before he died, she said. He planned to use it as proof. Ethan clicked the audio file. The recording began playing softly through the laptop speakers. Adrian's voice appeared first again, calm but tense. "You're the one controlling Westbridge." Another voice answered, older. "Confident, you've been digging into things that will ruin this company." Lena looked down. "That voice belongs to the company's chief financial officer." Ethan paused the recording and looked at me. Now the truth was unmistakable. Adrian had uncovered a massive financial operation led by someone at the very top of the company's financial structure. Brandon had simply been the employee forced to move the money. But before I could respond, something unexpected happened. The cafe door opened suddenly. All three of us looked up at the same time, and the man who walked inside made Lena freeze in her chair. Brandon Carter, my son-in-law. Natalie's husband. He stood just inside the doorway, scanning the room until his eyes landed directly on our table. My stomach tightened immediately. Ethan quietly closed the laptop screen. Brandon walked toward us slowly, his expression calm but cold. "Well," he said, pulling out a chair, "this explains a lot." Lena's hands were shaking slightly. "How did you know we were here?" Brandon gave a small smile. "When people start asking questions at the office, you learn to pay attention." He looked directly at me. "You should have stayed out of this, Gloria." His tone was no longer polite or charming. It was tired, almost defeated. I held his gaze calmly. "Adrian tried to help you, Brandon." His expression changed instantly. "Adrian was going to destroy everything." Ethan spoke quietly from beside me. "You weren't the one running the fraud." Brandon looked at him sharply. "You think that matters?" The cafe around us continued operating normally, people drinking coffee, talking quietly, completely unaware of the tension building at our table. I spoke carefully. "You were paying someone through Westbridge Holdings." Brandon's jaw tightened. For a moment he said nothing, then he leaned forward slightly. "You don't understand how this started." Lena whispered. "Adrian said the same thing." Brandon laughed softly. "Of course he did." His eyes moved toward the laptop bag beside Ethan. "You found the rest of the files, didn't you?" No one answered, but our silence confirmed everything. Brandon leaned back in his chair. "Adrian thought exposing the fraud would fix things," he said quietly, "but the man behind it would never allow that." I watched him carefully. "Then tell us the truth." Brandon hesitated for several seconds. Then he whispered something that made the air feel suddenly colder. "Adrian didn't die because of the money." My heart skipped. "Then why?" Brandon looked directly at me. "Because he was about to expose the person who controlled everything." Lena's voice trembled slightly. "The CFO?" Brandon shook his head slowly. "No." My pulse began racing again, because if it wasn't the CFO, then someone even more powerful was involved. Brandon lowered his voice until it was almost a whisper. "The person Adrian discovered owns half the company." The cafe suddenly felt very small. And for the first time since this investigation began, I realized something truly frightening. Adrian hadn't just uncovered fraud. He had uncovered the kind of corruption that powerful people will do anything to keep hidden. And now, those same people might already know we had the evidence. When Brandon Carter whispered that the person behind everything owned half the company, the air around our table seemed to freeze. For a moment, none of us moved. The cafe noise continued around us, cups clinking, quiet conversations, but at our table it felt like the world had paused. I looked straight into Brandon's eyes. "Then say the name," I told him quietly. He leaned back in the chair and rubbed his hands together slowly. For the first time since I had known him, Brandon Carter didn't look confident. He looked tired. Defeated. "You're already in too deep, Gloria," he said. I answered calmly. "My son died because of this. I passed too deep a long time ago." Ethan Cole, my digital investigator, sat beside me silently, but I could see him recording everything on his phone under the table. Brandon sighed. "The person Adrian discovered," he said slowly, "was Victor Halbrook." Lena Park gasped beside me. Victor Halbrook, the founder of the logistics company. The man whose face appeared on magazine covers and charity events. The man the entire company worshipped like a genius businessman. And according to Brandon, the man behind the entire financial fraud. For several seconds, I said nothing. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Did Victor Halbrook kill my son? Brandon looked down at the table. No, he said quietly, but Adrian was going to expose him. Lena spoke carefully. Adrian was building a full report. He planned to present it to the federal regulators. Brandon nodded, and Victor found out. The words settled over me slowly like cold rain. Then what happened the night Adrian died? I asked. Brandon swallowed. He met someone from Halbrook's office. Ethan leaned forward. Who? Brandon hesitated again, and that hesitation told me everything. You, I said quietly. Brandon looked up at me. I didn't plan to kill him, he said quickly. You have to understand that. But I already understood. Truth hides in numbers and silence, and right now Brandon's silence was louder than any confession. You were the last person to see him alive, I said. Yes, and you were the one who reported the accident. Yes, Ethan spoke carefully. So what actually happened? Brandon rubbed his face. Adrian confronted me with the evidence, he said. He said the transfers, the shell companies, everything traced back to Halbrook. Lena whispered, he was right. Brandon nodded slowly. He told me to testify. I felt my chest tighten. And you refused. I couldn't, Brandon said. Victor Halbrook destroys people who cross him, careers, families, everything. His voice cracked slightly. Adrian didn't care. That sounded exactly like my son, honest, fearless, stubborn when it came to the truth. He said the law would protect us, Brandon continued. But you didn't believe that, Ethan said. Brandon shook his head. We were arguing in the parking garage outside the office. Adrian tried to call the authorities. He stopped speaking. My hands clenched slowly. Then what? I asked. Brandon closed his eyes. I grabbed the phone. We struggled. He slipped. The cafe suddenly felt very quiet. He fell down the concrete ramp, Brandon whispered. He hit his head. My breath left my lungs slowly. For 2 years I had believed my son died in a tragic accident, and now I knew the truth. It wasn't planned, but it also wasn't an accident. Brandon looked at me. I panicked, he said. Halbrook's lawyers took control immediately. They ruled it a car accident. The company covered everything up. Lena's voice shook. You let Adrian be blamed as careless. Brandon whispered, yes. Ethan closed his laptop slowly. You just confessed, he said quietly. Brandon looked around the cafe. And what good will it do? He laughed bitterly. You think Victor Halbrook will ever be charged? The man owns judges. But that was the moment he underestimated something important. Not me, not the evidence, but patience. Rebecca Sloan, our family lawyer, had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and right then my phone buzzed quietly on the table. A message from Rebecca. Federal investigators are already here. I looked up at Brandon calmly. You should know something, I said. What? The authorities have been listening to this entire conversation. His face went pale. At that exact moment, the cafe doors opened. 2 federal agents stepped inside. Followed by 3 more, they walked directly toward our table. Brandon Carter, one of them said firmly. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, financial fraud, and involuntary manslaughter in connection with the death of Adrian Mitchell. Brandon didn't resist. He just sat there staring at the table as the agents placed the cuffs on his wrists. As they led him away, he looked back at me once. I'm sorry, he said, but apologies do not bring sons back. The cafe door closed behind them. And for the first time in 2 years, the truth had finally stepped into the light. Weeks later, the investigation exploded across national news. Victor Halbrook was charged with operating a multi-million-dollar financial fraud network through shell companies like Westbridge Holdings. Dozens of executives were implicated. The company collapsed under federal investigation. And Adrian Mitchell's name was officially cleared. The authorities confirmed he had been trying to expose the fraud. He was no longer remembered as a careless victim. He was remembered as a whistleblower, a man who tried to do the right thing, a man who refused to stay silent, a man who paid for the truth with his life. Months later, I visited Adrian's grave. I placed white lilies on the grass. My sweet boy, I whispered, you were right. The wind moved softly through the trees, and for the first time since the day he died, my heart felt quiet. Because the truth had finally finished what Adrian started. And if there is one lesson every woman listening to this story should remember, it's this: truth may hide for a while. But if you are patient, if you are brave, and if you refuse to stop looking, truth always finds its way back into the light.